What is social justice? And this story isn't my own. This is the stock story on social justice, but it's a good one. It truly illustrates the difference between charity and justice, both of which are called for by Jesus. Okay? And the story is this. To tell a story of a town, and the town was down a river, and there was a big bend in the river. They couldn't see up the river. And one day some kids were playing by the river, and they found 5 bodies were floating down the river. So they called some adults, and the adults quickly pulled these bodies out. 2 were dead, and they buried them. 1 was a child. They found a foster home. 1 person was severely ill. They took the person to the hospital. They found a place to live for the 5th person. And then it happened that each day, some bodies would come down the river. And the townspeople, very charitable, and they'd always do what needed to be done. If they were kids, they would find them foster homes, put them into schools. If somebody was sick, they'd put them in a hospital. If somebody needed help, they'd find them help. And they did this for years. It just became part of the town's ethos that every day they'd go to the river and they'd pull the bodies out and they'd do what needed to be done. But nobody ever thought of going up the river and finding out why those bodies were coming down the river. See, charity, which is very important. Jesus mandates charity, as we'll see. Charity is very important, but charity handles the bodies. So that we handle the poor. We give money to the poor. We have soup kitchens. We do things and so on. We set up, programs to help the poor. But that's only half of it. It's an important half, but it's only half of it. That's charity. Justice is the attempt to go up the river and say, why are there poor people? Why are there bodies in the river? Why can't some people make a living? Why are there people on welfare? Why is there racism in our culture? Why is there sexism? Why do those things happen? And how do they happen? See, social justice charity is about handling one-to-one charity. And it's very, very important. That's mandated by Jesus. But you'll see Jesus also mandates justice, and justice is what about the systems? The systems that cause this. And that's the distinction. And it's a very important distinction. Often in our minds and in our spirituality, we just blur this, And incidentally, we can be quite bipolar on this. We can be a person who's wonderfully charitable, but we're not looking at issues of justice, or vice versa. I know some people who are really committed to social justice, and they're not very good people at all. You don't want to be sitting beside them at table, and so on. So, but you need them both. We need to be people who handle the bodies. And when somebody rings your doorbell and this is money for a soup kitchen or something, or right now, for instance, and it's heartening to watch on television just the incredible response there is to the tragedy of Harvey, and just people opening their wallets and opening their houses and so on. That's wonderful. That's gospel. That's charity. Now, of course, hurricanes aren't a systemic issue. Okay, that's all we can do. A lot of times, all you can do is charity. But see, we're called as Christians to work for justice, and justice is to work up the river. Why are there bodies? Sometimes I give a more simple metaphor where I say, I can be a good person, and I might give you the shirt off my back. But I also have to ask, why do I have a closet full of shirts, and some people don't have a shirt at all? See, that's a different question. I wrote that in an article recently. I got a vicious letter from a man. He says, I earned all my shirts, and they should earn theirs too. Clearly, probably a very charitable Christian man. But notice that he doesn't see justice like these people should earn their own living. I want to talk about that. What would help us all sometimes is to do a course, what they call a sociology of poverty. How poverty and how these systems work. And I remember as a young student, I was like 19, was the University of Ottawa. And in this class on sociology of poverty, we were were all poor kids. We were kids from farms and blue-collar places and so on. You know, we grew up, we never had a nickel to rub together, and we never had school lunches, and we never had, you know, free tuition and all this type of stuff. In those days in Canada, we didn't have Medicare. So we were poor kids. And we were telling our professor one day, he said, you know, we resent these kids today. They're getting all these welfare checks, and they're getting this, and they're getting that, and they're getting your university paid for, and we have to earn this hard money. He said, we were poor kids. He had a great line. He said, none of you were ever poor kids. He said, you were rich kids who didn't have any money. Notice that's something different. He said, you were rich kids, you just didn't have any money. You know, poverty isn't about what you have in your wallet at a given time. You know, you see the opposite. You know, if you took a street person and he or she would win a lottery of $1 million, 6 months to a year later, they'd be back on the street. And conversely, if you took somebody like Donald Trump and took away all his money, in 3 years from now, he'd be a millionaire again. He'd have been a rich person who temporarily didn't have any money. This was, the person on the street would be a poor person who temporarily had some money. I once read a great line from the feminist Gloria Steinem. And Gloria Steinem said her mother was pretty badly overweight. And she said, I have the genes. She said, so my whole life, she said, I've been struggling to keep my weight down. She said, I've always kept it down. I've exercised and starved myself. She said, but I always think of myself as a fat woman who's slim at the moment. Okay. See, when I grew up, I was a rich kid who was poor for the first years of my life. I mean, who didn't have any money. I wasn't poor. I didn't have any money. Just something different. See, poverty isn't about the ad which I like so much, what's in your wallet. Okay. Poverty isn't about what's in your wallet at a given moment. It's, you know, how you're resourced, how you're connected. You know, the same thing, for instance, as an oblate or any religious. We have a vow of poverty, you know, but we can't really make ourselves poor. Once you're rich, you cannot make yourself poor. Why? So I'll give you an example, a man I'll talk about in a few minutes. We had a wonderful oblate called Larry Rosebow. And Larry Rosebow was shot to death in 2009 in Guatemala, fighting for the poor. But at one point, and Larry was a kid from St. Louis, Missouri, he went down to Recife, Brazil, and he lived for about 6 or 7 years on the streets with the poor people, didn't have a rectory, ate whatever they could scrounge up, and he just lived on the streets. And then what happened is he got hepatitis. So you know what we did? The Oblates flew him home, and we put him in a really good hospital where he got great medical attention. Then after we recovered, we took him to our mother house in France for 6 months to give him a sabbatical to recover from that. You know, if he had been a Brazilian, he'd have died. See, I can go and divest myself of this, but I'm rich. If I get sick, the Oblates will fly me to a good hospital. Then after I'm finished, they'll give me a sabbatical for 6 months in southern France, you know, to write a book. See, so even when we try to be poor, we can't be poor. And sometimes with the poor, even when they try, they can't because the system doesn't work for them. Okay. See, so charity responds to the immediate wound. Justice tries to uproot the cause of the wound. And that's why, as the title said, it's not good enough just individually to be good-hearted. It's not enough. Like Wallace said, it's not just what's in your heart. It's what's in the heart of public policy. And not just in the heart of policy. What's the history? What's our history? We don't start from the same place at all, you know. And, you know, there's not a level playing field in our world. There's not a level playing field in our country, you know. And no offense to him, because he was a great man, but for instance, Ronald Reagan used to say, any poor boy can become president of this country, because I did it. He could, but he was never poor. He was a rich kid who didn't have any money when he grew up. Okay. There's a lot of poor kids cannot become president of this country. Poverty is something else. Now, so justice works for systemic change. What is systemic change, or what are systems? Okay, major social issues have to do with, and I've picked these words carefully, poverty, terrorism, unjust economic systems, unjust wars, racism, abortion, sexism, the ecology, climate change, immigration, refugees, historical seizure of lands and cultures, human trafficking, access to health care and education, among others. Every one of these is a major justice issue. Let's just take the second one. We often don't think of terrorism, for instance, as a systemic issue. Like I can tease that out in one line. You know what happens right now? Every time we kill a terrorist, we produce 2 more. See, so just killing terrorists doesn't get any further ahead. So then the people get alienated and we produce more terrorists. The only way we're ever going to stop terrorism is by draining the swamps that produce them. This is a horrible analogy, but you can spray billions and billions of mosquitoes and kill them. But if you don't drain the swamps where they're being produced, they just keep killing mosquitoes, And thank goodness our public policies begin to realize that, for instance, the war on terrorism, we can't win it. We can't win it militarily. Now, we need to be involved militarily, but that war has to be won. The battle has to be won in big ways. People's hearts have to change and so on. So just to kill terrorists, if you're always producing more, notice there's a system that's working. It's bigger than an individual, than Jack who gets killed, and so on. Economic structures, unjust wages, racism. We'll look at abortion later on. Sexism. These are long-standing historical situations that given the sociology, the politics, the history around these things, you're always going to have them. Give you another analogy, taken from mental health. So imagine, let's take a woman, and she's in a small place, and she's in a really, really oppressive situation. Say a marriage that's bad, a community that's bad, and so on, and so on. And she has a nervous breakdown. They take her to a hospital, and then she gets really good help, and she gets really well, and finally she's really good. She goes back home. You know what's going to happen? In a year, she's going to break down again. See, because it's the situation that's causing the breakdown. That's why they say the private is political and the political is private. We don't live in isolated worlds and so on. So when our professor said, you were all rich kids who didn't have any money, he was looking at our sociology. We were all immigrant kids who grew up in families who valued education, hard work, and so on. It was simply, as soon as you get access, you're going to access this. I went to school with, a bunch of guys, most of them didn't finish high school. Today they're all millionaires because they knew how to work. They got sheet metal companies and so on, or they owned their own companies. They'd buy me and sell me with all my degrees. They all grew up without money. They were never poor, But when you see the sociology of ghettos and gangs and so on, it's very, very different. Not just any poor kid can be president of the United States. Kids who grew up without money can become president of the United States, but they're not poor. They're rich kids who don't have money. Okay, but see, all of these issues, they're systemic issues. That means it's the system, and to change them, you're always going to have them. We'll look at abortion afterwards. For instance, until a lot of systemic things change in our culture, we'll always have abortion, whether there's laws or not. Because it's being driven by, not by liberal ideology or whatever, it's just simply being driven by first of all, the sexual ethos in our culture. It's being driven by the economy. It's being driven by a lot of other things, And the individualized woman who finds herself pregnant with no support, she's just a victim inside of a system and we're always going to have them. You're going to have them by the thousands all the time in this system. You're going to have poor people, You're going to have, when you look at police brutality and everything else, it's going to happen in our present system. It's going to happen, and that's why it keeps happening. Jim Wallace, I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, just wrote a book in which he's really taken a lot of heat for writing this book. He's an evangelical from Washington who's probably as close to a Dorothy Day as our culture has produced, our churches, and so on. In fact, Wallace defines himself, he says, I'm an evangelical Christian convert to Roman Catholic social doctrine. Okay? And he means that. But he just wrote a book and he says, racism America's original sin. See, at the beginning of our history as human beings, Adam and Eve committed an original sin, and it's plagued us ever since. And Wallace says, he's white, but he says, he said at the beginning of our history we had slavery. We had slavery, and he says it's our original sin, and we haven't ever fully extricated ourselves from that. Now he takes a lot of heat. A lot of people challenge that. I saw him give that talk in Los Angeles at the conference this year, and a lot of people really went after him, but I think he's right. See, you can't just erase history because, it's there. We got to grow forward, and there's so much healing and so on. But he says slavery was Americans' original sin, and it was in our origins. And today we still have some of the fruits of that. And it's not that necessarily we're bad people. Same as we're children of Adam and Eve. We partly inherit their sin. We're children of a country that had slavery, and it just doesn't wash clean in 100 years. It might take 200 years for this to wash clean. That's at the origin. And it's a systemic thing. We're good people. We're caught in it. My youngest brother right now, who works for an oil company, works for Exxon in Canada, called Imperial Oil there. And actually, he's got a job now that's been very good for him because for years, he was in their head office and he was defending oil prices, But anyway, more recently, they've put him in a job where he has to negotiate with Indian chiefs about lands and oil rights and so on. And it's been a powerful conversion for him. He said, this is the way it goes. In fact, and he said, Exxon is offering these natives wonderful compensatory packages and so on. He said, but they'll go out to present this to a tribe. He said, they'll present it. He said, and when I'm finished, this will always be the response. He said, somebody will stand up and says, sir, he said, I've been polite up to now, but I've been holding my tongue, but let me say it honestly. He said, you know what you are? You're just the guilty white person who's here trying to assuage white guilt for all you've done to us. He said, one of them told, he said, and you're a Catholic, he said, the two organizations I hate the most in the whole world are the Catholic Church and Exxon, and you work for both. And my brother said, I tell him, it's true. But we have to move forward, We can't just erase that history. It's true. We are guilty white people, and it's not our fault. You didn't do that. We didn't take the land from the natives, and you didn't bring slaves over here and so on. But that's our history. That's where we're standing. And see, so that's what I mean. It's not enough to be good-hearted to say, well, I wasn't a slave owner, and I didn't take land from natives and so on. But somebody did. And that's part of our history. And it's still there. And it's still reaping untold amount of poverty and anger and stuff in people's minds, My brother said, I always say, that's true. I'm a guilty white person. But now, let's see if we can move forward. He said, oftentimes that's a good start. They say, yeah, let's talk about, then somebody will say, it wasn't your fault, it wasn't my fault. But there was a fault, See, so you and I, it's not what we did, it's where we're standing in history. See, that's to do with systems. Now, one last little bullet point on this before we move further, and that is that all these issues are interconnected. Concern for one issue demands concern for all these issues. See, I'll give you an example, and I don't want to pick on any one group, but for instance, oftentimes that's the criticism made of pro-life, and that is that it's a single issue. And see, if you're going to be pro-life, it's not enough just to be against abortion, because all these issues are intertwined. You see, abortion has to do with unjust economic structures and everything else, and so on. So that's what Cardinal Bernardine, and I think in a wonderful formulation where he talked about, you have to have the seamless garment. He called it the seamless garment. Like all these issues are one. We got to be just women and men across the board. We can't pick one of these, or climate change, or pick, the native thing, or human trafficking, or something. We might pick one that we get involved in, and so on, but we have to have a heart for them all and realize it's all of one piece. See, we can't have a just society that's they're really just in one area and they're unjust in other areas. After a while, the society's not just. It's all of one piece.